Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist and the author of the Complete Compliance Handbook, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 107 for the week ending June 15th, 2018, the Think You're Having a Bad Week edition. This week, our sponsor is Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective compliance and ethics programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even on individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help you improve your company's compliance and ethics programs, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at their website, www.affiliatedmonitors.com. This week, if you think you had a bad week, we're going to tell you about two companies that had a much worse week. That's, of course, Volkswagen and ZTE. We're also going to comment on the Time Warner, AT&T purchase of Time Warner from the compliance angle. We'll take a look at Bill Steinman's article about the FCPA is still not dead. Goldman Sachs is in trouble over peddling $600 million of 1MDB bonds for the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. We take a look at a CCO who behaved very badly, and then looked at the potential red flags of doing business in North Korea, courtesy Dick Casson of the FCPA blog. I know you'll find this episode fascinating, and thank you for joining us. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist and the author of the Complete Compliance Handbook, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 107 for the week ending June 15th, 2018. I think you're having a bad week edition. As always, I'm joined by Mr. Monitors himself, Jay Rosen of Affiliated Monitors. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. It's always fun to get together on a Friday morning and look at the FCPA Ethics and Compliance Week that was. And the first article we have is, we're actually calling this edition the Think You're Having a Bad Week edition. So if you are working at Volkswagen, your week probably did not start off well when the board of directors got together to discuss the probe, which is now actually going into the Audi unit of Volkswagen. And Munich prosecutors said on Monday that Audi chief executive Rupert Stadler and another member of Audi's top management were being investigated for suspected fraud and false advertising. Stadler had been under fire at Audi since 2015 in November, 2 months after Volkswagen, when it also to using illegal software to cheat admissions. VW Supervisory Board, which includes reps from the ruling families, labor leaders, shareholders, and officials from the group's home state of Lower Saxony, want to hear from the carmakers' lawyers what evidence the prosecutors have against Stadler. And basically, Munich prosecutors accuse Stadler of taking no action in late 2005 to stop deliveries of manipulated Audi models. So that was on the 12th. The next day, VW gets fined 1 billion euros by the German prosecutors for cheating admission standards. And this was basically the same thing as what Volkswagen pleaded guilty to. This new fine was not included in the 28.5 billion euros provisions that VW has set aside for the whole diesel cheating scandal. Then on June 14th, on Flag Day, prosecutors hold Volkswagen responsible as a whole for the whole diesel cheating scandal. And basically, the investigation concluded that the company failed to properly oversees its engine development department, but that the scandal cannot be attributed to a single department alone. So 3 really damning releases in a row, Tom, and really negates the initial story that came out of the gate that you had these rogue engineers messing up with the diesel emission controls.
Absolutely. So, as bad as Volkswagen's week may have been, Jay, ZTE had perhaps even a worse week. So, for those who may not be aware, in March, the Department of Commerce sanctioned ZTE, in April, ZTE having settled an export control case in March of 2017 at nearly $900 million in fine. In April, the Department of Commerce revoked ZTE's privileges to export goods from the United States, and that had the effect of killing off their supply chain of conductors, which allowed them to make cell phones, and it effectively put the company out of business. Donald Trump later decreed that because of the job losses in China, the Department of Commerce should rescind the fine and penalty, and they were able to work out a settlement, which included a $1 billion fine, a $400 million reserve, and most importantly, a compliance monitor be embedded into ZTE. This document was released this week, which spelled out in very, very vague details what the monitor was going to do. But it looked like ZTE was going to survive and that the matter would go forward. That is now in, if not dispute, certainly questioned, because certain members of Congress, in fact, the majority of Congress, really are up in arms over this settlement. They view ZTE as a threat to American national security, and that they should not be allowed to continue into business. So we have the controlling party in Congress, the Republicans, at odds with their president, who had ordered the Department of Commerce to resolve this matter. So that's the basic background. From the compliance angle, there's still many questions. SCCE incoming president Gerry Zack wrote a piece in the FCPA blog correctly noting that you shouldn't call these compliance professionals that are mandated by the Department of Commerce a compliance function, because they're monitors. They report to the Department of Commerce. Matt Kelly over on Radical Compliance had a really interesting post where he had informative FAQs and answers to his FAQs on the monitorship in the ZTE matter, and he conveniently and very helpfully linked to the entire order, which I would suggest you read if you're a compliance professional. And finally, I raised several questions that we're really in uncharted waters here. With a regulatory monitor in place from the Department of Commerce, we have a criminal sanction monitor in place, not selected by the Department of Justice, but selected by the court, where the criminal plea was accepted. It's not clear how, if at all, these two monitors will work together. It's not clear how the monitorships will be paid. It's not clear on really a lot of points. So lots of questions around the entire resolution. And of course, it's now completely overshadowed by the political question of whether Congress will allow ZTE to even exist going forward.
Another issue that both Gerry and Matt brought up is just the nomenclature of this position. And I don't think I've ever seen anybody referred to before as a compliance coordinator. Have you, Tom?
I've seen that title from time to time, but it's the entire nomenclature is very odd. Yes.
Well, and I think it really lacks, gravitas, and it really doesn't give any standing to that position. If you're a compliance officer or if you're a monitor, that's one thing. But if you're a compliance coordinator, that sounds to me like somebody who Xeroxes, collates, and staples documents.
You can tell you grew up in the corporate world, Jay. Names and titles are obviously very important there.
Well, they matter to some people, but I think that your authority sometimes stems from the title of your position. And if this ZT thing is supposed to move forward, you actually do need somebody who's not going to come in and be a rubber stamp. So On to an article we have from Henry Cutter, writing in the Wall Street Journal, the Morning Risk Report. He takes a look at the challenge of mergers for compliance, and two of our SCCE colleagues are quoted in the article, Joe Murphy and Christy Grant Hart. Joe's take on what happens is each company that comes together is going to have its own compliance program, and the challenge is going to be integrating them as the companies combined. Aspects of the task range from integrating technology to reviewing the compliance controls in place at a merger partner to melding cultures and adjusting risk tolerances. Christy Grant Hart, chief executive of Spark Compliance Consulting, said each compliance department will have its own compliance-related technology, systems for running a whistleblower hotline, assessing risks, or conducting due diligence. And each system is likely to contain years of data potentially dealing with different areas if the merging companies have focused on different types of risk in the past. Those records must be melded so the merging companies can assess risk on an apples-to-apples basis. And, this is something that, in the past, I would have approached this by trying to look at it that if they're multinational companies, where do you have your issues in terms of getting the ethics and compliance together on a global basis? But I think the point that both Joe and Christy make in this article is that not only is this a global issue, but this is a cultural issue that you really need to get set. And one of the things in this merger is that you've got a Hollywood, quote, creative type of company who's used to really doing things differently, like executives travel first class and they're met at the airport. And you've got a company like AT&T, which makes most of its management group travel coach. So those kind of things are just surface differences, but when you take them to heart from an ethics and compliance perspective, there really will be a challenge of getting the corporate culture right.
So I really thought that was a very interesting article that Henry put together, and the focus is something that I don't think really gets as much play as it should, Jay. I think many of our listeners are going to be aware of the DOJ and SEC requirements around both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition compliance activity, but this article really went in a different direction, which you really spelled out, which is the culture. And, you've been through, I think, a merger where the culture was just a disaster. The cultural fit between the two entities was just a disaster. And there was a very interesting article today, I think, in the New York Times that spoke about the point you raised, but specifically around HBO, and that HBO has a lot of creative freedom. And they take a very meta view of things. They put out a relatively small amount of content, but it's extremely expensive, extremely high quality, and for the most part, extremely successful. And that is not the model of the way AT&T thinks through things. They are a regulated industry. They are very focused on tactical, operational success because people like you and me who buy a phone, that's what we want. And it's really a completely different mindset, I think, from the sort of creative turns. And your point even on, the style of travel that is engaged in Hollywood and those types of relationships, those are very different from AT&T. So I think it's going to be really interesting to really look at this cultural fit. I would say if we want to go to maybe outside this merger, look at what happened with WhatsApp and Facebook. We had two founders of WhatsApp have left within the past year, leaving literally $1.2 billion on the table because they left earlier than their agreements specified vesting of stock. And they did it because of disagreements with the leadership at Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg, over whether WhatsApp would have advertisements on it. And Sheryl Sandberg's position was, I think correctly, we own you. We will do with you what we want, irregardless of what we said we would do. You are now us, and us will make the decision. So whether that extends to this merger, but there's really a really interesting cultural tension that you really spoke about, and where that goes, how that impacts compliance, we're just going to have to see going forward.
Good stuff. So I want to flash back to 18 months ago, and as the Trump administration was coming into power, there were lots of chicken littles running around saying that, President Trump has a famous soundbite where he calls the FCPA a horrible law. But I think we have Bill Steinman, who's coming to us through the FCPA blog, who has a great piece on the fact that FCPA enforcement is not dead. Can you tell us about that, Tom?
Sure. Bill wrote a really good piece this week, and I even emailed him and told him I thought it was very well done. But he laid out several facts about current FCPA investigations and enforcement. First, that there are currently 133 public companies that have open investigations, and that's very close to the largest number ever, and that's only public companies that we know about. We don't know about privately held companies who may have to disclose that. Second, that the Department of Justice and SEC have continually reminded us over and over again in the last 16 months that the FCPA remains one of their top priorities. Obviously, we had the release of the evaluation of corporate compliance programs in February of 2017, but Bill correctly pointed to the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy announced in November 2017, which is part of the U.S. Sentencing Manual, and the new piling on policy, all both moving forward. And of course, the incorporated in the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy was bringing forward some of the better elements of the 2016 FCPA pilot program. Next, he said, go to FCPA Inc. and see how much business they do or don't have. That there's a ton of business that lawyers and other third-party vendors and suppliers are doing around the FCPA space. And then finally, in a really interesting, I won't say provocative, but moving up towards that sort of adjective, Jay, he says that the enforcement of the FCPA is entirely consistent with the administration's America First approach to foreign policy. And so that it's within, he believes, Bill, that it's an extension of American foreign policy to aggressively target foreign companies that have engaged in bribery and corruption. By his reckoning, 2018 has already become the fifth biggest year ever in terms of FCPA fines and penalties. And as of today, June 15th, 2018, we're not even halfway over. So with a large number of cases being filed, being self-disclosed, investigations being noted, and there are several big ones out there that we're waiting for resolution on. So he really laid out, I thought, a great series of arguments of why the FCPA is not dead, why it's still very actively being enforced, and why every company needs to respond with a robust best practices compliance program.
So here's the part that I just loved, appealing to my sales and business development hat that I wear sometime. And he writes, I think too much has been made about the relatively low number of settlements last year. Too much emphasis is placed on the number of resolutions before January 20th and those coming afterwards. As he said before, FCPA investigations proceed at their own pace. We do not forget that the FCPA and the SEC are not private corporations trying to make their numbers by the end of the quarter or the end of the year. So, that's right. These things do go according to their own time schedule. And we will have enough stuff to talk about every week. So I think there's nothing for us to worry about in terms of that on this point. In the past, Tom, we've talked a lot about Malaysia and the 1MD scandal. What is the newest angle on that?
Well, that's 1MDB. That's the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And Malaysia had an election earlier, I guess in May, where they basically threw out the corrupt regime and they brought in a regime to hopefully clean things out. And they have moved aggressively against the former president and his wife. They barred them from leaving the country. They've replaced corrupt ministers. They've replaced ministers at banks who all facilitated the corruption scandal around 1MDB. But now we have information that the government is moving towards some of the third-party providers who facilitated the corruption, or at least the alleged corruption. And one of those is alleged to be Goldman Sachs, who made $600 million peddling 1MDB bonds. And then the allegation is a large portion of the money from the sale of those bonds was diverted in corruptly to individuals within the government. So the Malaysian government has said they want some of that money back. They said they are cooperating extensively with the United States, and the United States is cooperating back extensively with Malaysia. If you'll recall, Jay, we've talked about several of the anti-kleptocracy suits filed in the 1MDB scandal for goods and property in the United States to be reclaimed and remitted to Malaysia. The Wolf of Wall Street was funded with corrupt money from that scandal. And certain properties were bought in New York and Los Angeles, or at least alleged to have been bought from money purloined from 1MDB. And now we have a Malaysian government who wants to pursue that. So Goldman Sachs is probably the highest profile company. We're very close to the prior administration in Malaysia. But if your company did business with 1MDB, I would start scrubbing those emails and seeing if you've got anything that you need to be worried about, because I think this is going to continue to be a worldwide scandal. And now that you have Malaysia and the United States, it looks to be aligned moving forward to get purloined money back and go after those who were involved in the corruption. I think it's going to become significantly more public.
Have you been reading some Sherlock Holmes lately? You said purloined twice in the span of a minute.
I read Sherlock Holmes all the time, even just for fun. I sometimes just sit down and we'll read a few lines. One of my favorite series of books. Yes, in fact, I'm trying to figure out what my next Sherlock Holmes themed week should be.
So in a sarcastic Hollywood throwaway line, I think it's almost fitting that the Wolf of Wall Street was financed by illegal funds. And in terms of people wanting restitution, I would also bet pretty surely that the Wolf of Wall Street did not turn a profit, so there won't be any money coming back to those bilked investors.
So are you going to get into the eccentricities of movie accounting now, Jay?
Well, I don't know. I didn't do well in accounting at Wharton. I was more of a marketing guy, but I can just tell you the game is rigged and movies are set up not to make a profit.
Well, we'll have to explore that from the compliance angle at some point going forward. Well, Jay, we had a interesting report from Michael Griffiths over at GIR about some remarks made by FCPA, DOJ FCPA Unit Chief Dan Kahn. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so there was a panel last week on the 13th of June in Paris, and there's been some great reporting coming from that meeting about just where we've come in terms of FCPA. And Dan Kahn, who you spoke with recently, said that it's incredible that when he first started, he wouldn't have thought that people would think the way they have about the FCPA. And typically, Kahn said, a foreign bribery case will traverse 4 or 5 countries because a company that will face investigations from its home company, the homeland of the foreign official where the company was bribed, places where intermediaries facilitated the scheme, and the jurisdictions where banks were used to funnel corrupt funds. Despite generally praising the sea change in which the global efforts to combat corruption, Khan conceded that conducting investigations with multiple authorities presents several challenges. There are differences in laws, techniques, and there's always complicated issues of how you determine who is going to get what. He said companies can make their lives easier by cooperating with all jurisdictions at the same time. Quote, we've had companies try to silo off various countries, Khan said. That's not going to be beneficial to the company. And at the end of the day, it results in a much worse resolution. So was it earlier this month that Rod Rosenstein spoke about the piling on issue? And if you take Dan's advice, and if you are cooperating simultaneously with all jurisdictions, the hope is that you will get a better outcome, and you will get some of the penalties that you're paying to the U.S. Applied to other jurisdictions, which will hopefully, at the end of the day, reduce your exposure. So it really, again, speaks to the cooperation that's happening out there, that it's paying dividends, that we are working with foreign regulators, and that there really is no way that you can game the system. Once you are in the crosshairs, the best that you can do is cooperate. And we've seen that even if you don't self-report, that there still can be substantial benefits for cooperating with multiple regulators.
Jay, one last piece I wanted to mention was I thought a great article by Dick Casson earlier this week over on the FCPA blog, and he detailed the potential red flags about doing business in North Korea with Donald Trump's new best buddy, Kim Jong-un, and that North Korea is near the bottom of the corruption perception index. One index rates them dead last. The bribery and corruption is pervasive, and corruption is endemic at every level of the state. The bottom line is, if you're going to, perhaps other than Dennis Rodman, but if you're going to do business with Dennis and his buddies in North Korea on behalf of President Trump, you need to tread very carefully. And I would remind people that the many U.S. companies went into Libya immediately after Gaddafi denuclearized, and many of those companies are now under FCPA investigation. The United States government, the State Department, multiple entities in the U.S. will probably say do business with North Korea at the appropriate time, but they will not say violate the FCPA to do so. So and Dick's article really lays out the facts of at least the red flags of doing business, and I thought it was a really good article by Dick Casson.
Yeah, it's also really sobering too, just in terms of what not only the economic climate is there in North Korea, but also just the personal freedoms or lack thereof. And it's still a society where men, women, and children are subjected to forced labor and sex trafficking, among other indignities. So it really is interesting who we are choosing these days as our global friends and who we are not supporting as a nation. So I guess I'm a sarcastic monitor guy and Debbie Downer. But Tom, tell us some good stuff about your book and where you're traveling to in the next couple weeks.
Well, thank you. Yeah, on the book, I've got two pretty exciting events coming up. One is in Houston on Thursday, June 28th from 5:30 to 7 at the River Oaks Bookstore. I'm doing a book signing. On Monday, June 25, I will be in Boston, where I'm meeting with the Boston Compliance Group in the evening for perhaps a cool drink, and we're going to talk about my book. And then on Tuesday, June 16th, at the Compliance Week Technology Conference, I'm going to have a book signing at the end of the day, once again, at the cocktail hour. I'm also putting on next week a FCPA, compliance masterclass here in Houston, 10.5 hours of continuing legal education credits approved by the state of Texas. So if you need some CLE or you want to learn about compliance, I've got a couple of seats left. I've got the links to information and registration on the event. Sales are still going well. And then finally, I'm going to pitch this over a little bit to you, but let me serve it up by saying that Affiliated Monitors has graciously offered to hold a breakfast and compliance event on Monday, June 25 in Boston, where I'm going to be up there. We're going to talk about the story of compliance as the story of innovation. You want to fill that out a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. Well, even the FCPA, even the compliance evangelist gets hungry and has to eat. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to have some of our local Boston colleagues and friends stop by Affiliated Monitors office, have some coffee, compliance, FCPA, and a healthy dosage of Tom Fox. So the event will be a week from this coming Monday, which is June 25th. We realize people have busy days, so we'll start a little bit early at 8 a.m. and for about an hour or so. We hope you'll have an engaging conversation with Tom about ethics, compliance, and FCPA. There is sign-up links on LinkedIn, and I think Tom is circulating it to his network. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me at Rosen at affiliatedmonitors.com, and we'll make sure to get you on the list.
So pretty eventful week. I certainly had a better week than VW and ZTE. How about the Rosens?
Rosen's had a great week because school is over, and that means only 5 more days till M&M go to sleepover camp. So do you remember they used to have, David Letterman used to have the Phil Donahue countdown calendar? Do you remember that? Right. So I've got a mental Millie and Michaela countdown calendar, but they are off to camp, and the summer has started. So as you correctly pointed out in our pre-call conversation, June is always a great time to be a Red Sox fan, right?
Indeed. So the pennant races are at this point looking very competitive. Astros are back in first in the West, and I think the Red Sox are still in first in the East. So hopefully both within the divisions and then within the American League will stay competitive, so we can continue to be able to talk about it during the rest of the season.
Well, and then we have training camp starting in July, so then it gets really serious. I'm hearing great things about the Houston quarterback. Are you reading the same things?
I'm hearing those things, but before we get there, we got to get through the World Cup. So
the World what?
Yeah, the World what? The World Cup started yesterday.
We are not fielding a side here for the red, white, and blue, correct?
So when you're married to an English woman, you have a team.
Okay. What does the draw look like for the England side?
So England really has an interesting philosophy, which is they expect to lose at all times at everything. So when they do lose, they're not disappointed. And if they win, it's a bonus.
It sounds like they're Red Sox fan.
It's not a very Texan perspective, that's for sure. So they're in looks like a draw that they can get through to the quarterfinals and the knockout rounds. But it is England, so we'll just have to see.
All right. So I'm going to take us on home. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, Episode 107, the Think You're Having a Bad Week edition. We appreciate you listening in every week, spending some time with us, and we hope you have a great summer weekend. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings, help get the word out about the only weekly wrap-up podcast in compliance. Also, if you have any questions, you can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening to This Week in FCPA, and I hope you'll join us again next week for another episode where Jay and I wrap up all of the week's top compliance and ethics stories. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.